Hello, and this time we come to the fourth and concluding week of or day really, of the Advent season. This would be the fourth Sunday of Advent, and I think as we've noticed before, this year it happens to also stand as the Sunday immediately preceding the celebration of Christmas. So the readings for today, or for this time, are from Samuel, the Old Testament book, chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, verses 8b through 12, verses 14a, and verses 16. Now the reason for that is they abbreviate a story that serves sort of as the background for this week. The second reading from the book, letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 16, verses 25 through 27. And the gospel brings us now to the gospel tradition according to Luke, who, as we know, tends to present the stories that we are most familiar with regard to the celebration of the birth of Jesus. The gospel is from Luke 1, verses 26 through 38. And what is the decision, or when we come to this fourth week or Sunday of Advent, is that it is in a particular way a Sunday which remembers either the parents or the grandparents of the birth of Jesus, but this time remembers a scene that we are more familiar with and which we hear very often when we celebrate feast in honor of our Blessed Mother, namely the Annunciation, the occasion in which the angel Gabriel is pictured as speaking to Mary and offering her the opportunity to become the mother of the Redeemer. Now, keep in mind as we look at the gospel this time, that I'm looking at the understanding of the gospel, some of which will be reinterpreted by the Christian tradition and Christian church as time goes on. So we want to look at it a little bit, if we can, from the context of the writer of this gospel and the times in which it was written and the understandings that it has. So all of that is to be a little vague on purpose, because some of the things that we notice may not be the way in which we will certainly hear homilies this weekend, or that we have come to understand it. Now, as a background, and that's what we hope to do with these little presentations, the ancient Mediterranean world, people believed that unless prevented by appropriate means, a man and a woman who found themselves alone together would inevitably have sexual relations. So for that reason, men, usually in this case fathers, husbands, brothers, were commissioned to be watchful and protective of the women in their care. You might check the book of Sirach, chapter 26, to find out where this message is coming from. Now, there were different strategies by which this could be achieved. Number one, a woman would always be in the company of other women and of children. That would protect them, and that would make sure that this possibility didn't happen. Secondly, would be the structure of the house. Now, this is interesting because in the way in which the houses were built, this would be with the more well-to-do, obviously, were built something like, but not exactly like, a triangle or a rectangle. There would be rooms all around the outside, but the inner part, the inner court, would be a place which would protect women, keep men away, okay? So that was another way in which this honoring the honor, and I use that word, of course. Remember that much of the discussion of this time had to do with honor and shame, where the honor of the woman would be recognized and protected. Now, with that in mind, when we look at this story, keep in mind that the angel would be considered to be an intruder. In other words, coming into the inner as part of the home. Mary is betrothed, and that, of course, is correctly identified by the gospel writer. And therefore, any intruder would be considered suspicious. Now, I smile a little because many of our paintings, of course, of Mary and the angel are not aware of this or do it in such a way that it creates an impression already that may not have been the intent. When we think about it, we really don't know what Mary is doing when the angel appears, okay? One of the artists, painters, likes to see her as, well, praying. Even puts a prie-dieu there for her to kneel on as the angel approaches her. All of that is artistic development, by that I mean by artists, but that's not what Luke really says. He doesn't say very much of what Mary is doing. Was she praying? Was she working? Was she doing ordinary household activities? Keep in mind that that would be a very traditional way of thinking on the part of the gospel writer Luke. All right. So he finds her, and now here again is a way in which Mary is understood. It's an honorable angel, all right? That's, of course, the way in which she is, and recognizes her status and greets her as thus: "Greetings, favorable ones. The Lord is with you. Do not be afraid. God will take care of things." So all of this is geared in a way, when we think about it, these words and the way in which they are said, protect the honor of Mary. Mary, however, is still properly concerned about her honor status. Keep in mind that this is one way of interpreting this whole scene. She is fully aware of the significance and consequences of the angel's message. And this will be a new challenge that will emerge in her betrothal status. After all, the crisis of a pregnancy can cause problems now for both families. How does this happen? And although it's certainly important to notice that the angel says to Mary, nothing is impossible for God, and that he will empower her with the power of the Spirit, and that the Spirit of God will protect her. So all of that is that Mary is not quickly running into saying yes without kind of doing a little bit of challenging here. And that's why what I'm wanting to kind of suggest here, that sometimes Mary has been portrayed here as, no offense here, but as meek and humble. The angel says, you're going to do this, God will take care of things, and she says, okay, be it done unto me as you will. But Mary here encounters this message of God. She's not hesitant to be quiet. She does not need to kind of prayerfully meditate on what is being accomplished on the part of God's purposes. In fact, this story, now if we take it from another point of view, keeping in mind that the gospel writer is well aware with the Hebrew tradition, might see this as what we would call in our understanding of some of the patterns that are developed in New Testament writing as a call story. In the call story, someone is brought invited to enter into something, and there's a certain pattern that follows. In the Old Testament, the prophets were often called. Let's take here perhaps the greatest model, the call of Moses. One remembers that Moses had been called by God in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus with the burning bush, and that Moses had been called in ordinary life. He had been taking care of sheep, the sheep of his father-in-law. And when he had gone up the hill to kind of check things out, well, what time of the day was? It was when they were taking care of the sheep. Where is Mary? Isn't she perhaps engaged in the ordinary activities of life? There is a kind of, all right, now she gets the message, and the message is rejoice, for you have found favor with God. Moses is found as one finding favor with God and is called to a particular mission, you remember? Go, I have seen the agony and suffering of my people, and I'm sending you to liberate them and to bring them out of bondage into the land of freedom. That's the call given to Moses. Now you remember that Moses doesn't just jump into it and say, oh, okay, God, what is it that you want? Notice that same thing occurs here in this so-called Annunciation story, that she is told that God has a special task for her. And as Moses had challenged God and says, look, I am not really the one that you want for this. Give me a sign. And notice that here, the sign that Moses receives is that he is given the staff and that he is told that his brother Aaron will work with him. What is Mary's question? Mary's question to the angel is, well, look, I'm not with child. I'm not pregnant. How can this be? We often think of Mary as simply accepting things, but she really challenges in a certain way, not only the angel, but he is, after all, the messenger of God, and it challenges. How can this be? We know the normal care messages of life, and prophets, and is this what is part of this call story? After all, Moses was to be the prophet for God. Is Mary to be the prophet for God also, in the sense that the mission that is granted to her or asked of her will be one that will change the way in which the life of others is affected here. The message then is, well, what is the sign that is given to Mary? Well, your relative, who is in her 6th month, is also pregnant, and she who was thought barren is now going to have a son. Now notice all of this is really a response to the question of Mary, looking for an assurance in some way that what the angel is saying to her truly is God's message. Now, then, of course, she gives the answer, be it done unto me according to your will. One needs to hear, and some of the commentators on this particular little assent to Mary, now I got to be very careful here because it is really the key often to how we interpret this whole scene, that Mary says, be it done unto me according to your will. But what if, and this is the way in which, at least a way to think about it, and some interpreters have suggested it, that Mary's response is, well, here I am. After all, I've argued with you, I've tried to make the case, and often that's the way in which these call stories end. In the end, you can't best God. And Moses, of course, says, all right, God, I'll do what you want. And Mary here might also be seen as, let it be to me according to your word. Now, this foreshadows in a certain way. And notice that the words that are used here, let it be done to me according to your word, the words of her son, Jesus, in the Mount of Olives, the garden, on the night after the Last Supper, not my will, but your will be done. So Luke kind of matches here that what Mary's assent is similar to what the assent of Jesus will be when the trials and difficulties of his passion and death take place. So one way to see this, and I know we've got to be very careful here, is Mary really says to God, look, I've lost the argument. Whatever you want, let it be done. So although it is certainly a wonderful assent on the part of Mary to the message of God, she just doesn't take it, and that's the whole point, a little bit of our reflection this time, lying down, as if there is nothing she could do, and as if she's just, and that's why some say that the term, behold, the handmaid of the Lord. Now, handmaidens, by the way, was a term used for slaves, and Mary here is more than a slave. Perhaps she is the servant of God, the messenger of God, the prophet of God, and therefore willingly accepts what is being asked of her. But to think of Mary as the slave, and that's why those who translate this handmaid remember that that's the connection. So what I'm really developing here a little bit in our discussions this time is how the language of the Scripture was and understood in the time frame in which it was written by those who originally kind of saw this. So Mary here is seen, certainly as I'm suggesting, as a strong woman who has a direct encounter with God, who does not hesitate to question and does not need the mediation of a man to accomplish God's purpose. She does what he wants, what God wants. And that's, again, a part of these as called stories. There's no one else kind of bartering between. They make their own their own decisions. Mary's name, a couple of other quick little additions here, is Miriam. One will remember that happened to be the sister of Moses' name, Miriam. And there's more and more connection between Moses and his call and Mary and her call by God. Luke doesn't really tell a lot about what we know about Mary, if you think about it. We know her name. We know the name of her town, Nazareth. We know that she's a virgin and espoused to a man named Joseph. And there's a stress on the insignificance of her social status. Now, it is difficult to reach sure conclusions about the social economic status of a majority of Galileans, but certainly when one thinks of it, Joseph is not a poor peasant, but is one who has had sufficient income to be able to travel from Jerusalem each year for the feast of the Passover. Sometimes when we think of Mary as certainly being a member of the poor, that's important, but it doesn't necessarily mean the poorness of poverty, that is in terms of lack of income, lack of place to stay, lack of clothing. So again, when we look at Mary's decision here to accept, and that of course is what is brought to our attention, that out of the ordinarynesses of life, and that is a consistent pattern that is developed by the Lucan writer, as we have noticed in the past, indicates here certainly a willingness on the part of Mary to accept what God is asking, and going back to something that we mentioned at the beginning, the honor of Mary, the honor of her family, the honor of all that will take place is respected. Keep in mind, if you thought about this in a practical way, and this does go a little bit beyond what is said here, that when Mary accepts the role to become a mother, then, as they sometimes point out, the neighbors talk. They are going to notice that Mary is pregnant. And the question that is going to arise, certainly perhaps in both, not only in the families, but also among the neighborhood, is, how did you get this condition? Aren't you the betrothed? Aren't you and Joseph living apart? How did you become part of the human story in bringing into this world a child? And by the way, how come we know the gender of this child? You know, we take a lot of things for granted these days, but in those days, nobody knew what the gender of the newborn would be until the newborn popped into this world. So there are certainly here, and that's my point now, theological and what we call Christological emphasis. And that is also what Luke is bringing in here, that the theology and Christology here is that God is behind the activities that are happening, that the birth of the child through the Virgin Mary is a gift of God, and that moves beyond what humans are capable of. Although certainly there are a number of other questions here that one might be willing to kind of look at. Let me just talk a moment about the first reading, which is brought up to guarantee a sense of the lineage of Jesus. The story from the book of Daniel is that David, the great king, finds himself in a situation of peace in the city of Jerusalem. And he looks around and notices that the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent kept outside of the city of Jerusalem. And he wants to build a temple, a worthy house for the Lord. And he calls in his prophet Nathan and explains to Nathan what he wants to do, that he wants to build simply that. Well, we call it a house, or he calls it a house, but it really is a temple. Nathan, of course, a prophet, as we have noticed on a number of occasions, simply the word prophet means a spokesperson. Nathan, therefore, is officially the spokesperson for King David, and he agrees, all right, Dave, if that's what you want to do, then let's do that. However, God now, that evening or shortly thereafter, talks to Nathan and says to him, look, go and tell David that I am perfectly happy not to have a house. I dwelt with the Israelites as they wandered through the wilderness. I was in what was known as the dwelling tent, and the tent moved with the Israelites as they traipsed through the desert and the wildernesses on the way to the promised land. But you go and tell David that I will build a house for him. Now, here is the reason why. Of course, I think this story is told. So Nathan reports back to David that let the building of the house go, that is the permanent idea of a temple. One of your heirs, namely your son, will be responsible for building the temple. And that does turn out to be the case when Solomon, who is the successor of David, builds the temple in Jerusalem. However, here now the idea of house is given a different meaning. It will have to do with the idea of a dynasty. And God says to David, I will build a dynasty for you so that your son, your heirs, will always be kind of flowing from your lineage and from your line. And that, of course, is what we are familiar with when we hear the line of David. That is brought up both in the Matthean and the Lucan accounts. Historically, the house of David did come to an end. It did not go, it would later be eliminated. But Christian tradition and the writers that we've just mentioned see that this lineage of David did continue, and it is of this line that Jesus is born. So in that sense, and I think the beginning of this is interesting, that Nathan and David developed this plan in a time of peace. Will this be the kind of situation of the descendant of Mary and Joseph, that it will also be a time of peace? So when one notices all of these kind of things, let us just bring a little bit to a conclusion this time. The fact that Mary is not pictured as necessarily a pious lady, woman, just spending her time, and I don't mean this in any unkind way, just praying, but she is a woman who looks forward to a future. Keep in mind that Mary at this time in her life must be what we would call a 16 to 18-year-old, and even that would be a later time for marriage, because often these family marriages were arranged much earlier in the lives of their children. Mary is pictured here as courageous, certainly joining with Joseph, having even to explain, can you imagine the dialogue that took place? Now, of course, we have the Matthean story where Joseph is approached by an angel and told that the child to be born is of God, and that he is to name him Jesus. That's Matthew's way. But what if you didn't have Matthew's story? What if we just had Luke's story? Can you imagine the dialogue that had to take place between Mary, Joseph, and even her family as to how she became pregnant? So that there are a number of unanswered questions here that, again, require a great deal of faith and a great deal of trust. And so certainly that's built into these stories. The trust that Mary has in God. The trust that Mary has that the words, nothing is impossible for God, will be fulfilled. The trust that her life with Joseph and the family will be one that will be ordinary enough to raise their child in the values and ways that they hold important. So all of that is important, and certainly the ending of this episode is that the angel representing God is standing in a certain way waiting for the consent of Mary, and that is the way in which Luke sees the story of Christian salvation moving forward, that with her yes, with her okay, with her agreement to do what God wills, then unfolds the whole wonderful story of salvation that we find episodically, how's that, in the story of Luke. Coming up immediately, as I mentioned, this being the last Sunday of Advent, beginning right away after this week, the next day already is the celebration of the birth of the Lord. And there again is another wonderful episode. Perhaps at some time in the future we'll be able to discuss a little more in depth the second chapter of this gospel. As we know, Mary, after her interview, if you want, encounter with the angel, meets her cousin Elizabeth, there again is kind of the human side of it. Mary has to tell somebody what has happened, and that's Luke's way, because the child conceived by Elizabeth, of course, John the Baptist, is wonderfully of God. And by the way, the messenger to both Zachary and Elizabeth and Mary is the same messenger, Gabriel. All of that I'm sure you're aware of. As we come to this day, my wishes for certainly a very blessed and happy Christmas to all, as we once again remember how Mary's yes comes to a fruitful and important beginning. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.